All right. All right. Well, welcome everyone. My name is Nicole Barbaro. I am the Director of Communications, Marketing, and Events here at Heterodox Academy, and I'm very excited to welcome our special guest, Sarah McLaughlin, today to talk about her brand new book, Authoritarians in the Academy. We're going to have a nice long discussion about some of the key topics and interesting stories and implications for free expression on campus. So we also welcome all your questions on that as well. It's a great opportunity to get your questions answered directly by the author. But before we get started, we have just a few little housekeeping notes of sorts to take care of. This is an official HXA event, so we do ask that you follow the HXA way, especially in the chat. We welcome you all to chat with fellow attendees and have little side discussions, and we'll monitor and keep an eye on the chat as much as we can to try to incorporate anything that you may be discussing. But of course, if you do have a question, we do ask that you pop it directly in the Q&A box. That's where I'm going to be pulling from throughout the event to get your questions answered by Sarah on this topic. And if you are interested, if you're new to HXA events, or you may not be aware of all the other wonderful things that we have going on here at HXA, please do look at these QR codes here. We have a weekly bulletin and lots of other emails with interesting content and alerts for different events if you like today's event and want to come to more. So please subscribe to our newsletter to stay up to date on everything happening at Heterodox Academy. We also have our wonderful free The Inquiry Substack, where our Heterodox Academy staff shares a lot of different insights on various current events in higher education. So please do also subscribe to that. We publish a couple posts a week typically there. So that's a great source to kind of stay up to date on what's happening in the world of open inquiry. And of course, if you work in higher ed in any sort of capacity or are a graduate student, we do invite you to become a member and join the 8,000 other faculty, staff, and graduate students that are advancing our mission on their campuses. So we welcome you to join us formally. And we do have some wonderful big events that we want to call out. We have started some regional conferences that are taking place. We are just in Colorado recently, and coming up next month, we are having our regional conference at the University of Maryland, College Park, for kind of the Mid-Atlantic region. So you can find more information on our website. And we also are having another regional conference in late October up at Simon Fraser University in Canada. So we welcome you all, if you're in that area, to check out those conferences and join us for those regional events. All right, well, let's get started today. Sarah, thank you so much for joining us. I'm very excited to talk about this wonderful book with you. And for those of you who may not be familiar, Sarah McLaughlin is a senior scholar of global expression at the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, or FIRE. And she studies the relationship between authoritarianism, free nations, and global censorship. Her writings have been featured in a variety of high-profile outlets. And of course, what we're here today to talk about is your very first book, which I realize my background is not allowing me to show you, but you have it perched up on your shelf back there. So we're going to talk about your book, Authoritarians in the Academy. So thank you so much for joining us here today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited for this conversation.
Awesome. Well, I absolutely love this book. I'm a big fan of books in general, and this is right up my alley, looking at higher education books. And there's a lot of surprising things that you bring to light in your book. I think personally, I had known of kind of some influence of, what we're going to be talking about in terms of especially foreign governments and how their differences in free expression laws may be impacting and chilling speech on US campuses. But I recall from reading the book myself that, there was a lot of events, especially in the last decade or so, that have really kind of brought this issue to the forefront of conversation. And personally, I was shocked at just how many different cases there actually were in the US, but you actually have a whole chapter that details events that are happening globally, and having some really high profile cases in here as well. But you mentioned that there was a specific case at George Washington University that kind of prompted your interest in this topic and really prompted you to sit down and write this book. Can you tell us a little bit more about kind of that specific incident and how you got interested in these issues?
Yeah, so I had, been thinking about this book for some time. I've been working on these issues at Fire about foreign censorship, especially when it comes to international students and academics. And so honestly, I would say a couple of weeks after I had sat down to start writing this, there was this really disturbing incident at George Washington University. And this was in early 2022. It was just ahead of the Beijing Winter Olympics. And there were students there who had decided to post artwork by a dissident Chinese Australian artist. And if you look at it from far away, the artwork kind of might look like promotional posters for the Olympics. But if you look closer, it was not the case. And instead, what it did was draw attention to human rights violations in China, surveillance, censorship, abuse of minorities, and make the broader point that maybe it was not appropriate for these games to be held in China, which is a pretty basic political expression or political opinion to have and make on a college campus. But so students posted these anonymously, and very quickly, some student groups went to George Washington University's leadership to complain, and they said, these posters are offensive, they're hurtful, and they insult China, and the university needs to act. And not only did George Washington's president at the time agree to act and agree to censor the posters, so they were ripped down, he said, we will investigate and unmask who posted this artwork that's criticizing the Chinese government. And so at the time, when this was all, first breaking, I wrote about and I said, what is GW thinking here? I mean, if you look at this from a basic question of a free speech issue on campus, it's bad. And if you look at it on the broader question of, what are the risks here? It's way worse. Because I said if these are international students from China who get put on their disciplinary record that they posted artwork criticizing the Chinese government, these students could be in sincere peril when they return home, all because they criticized their government on a college campus where free speech is promised. And so George Washington, to its credit, the university admitted it made a mistake. But it's sort of the perfect example of a lot of the factors at play here. You have international students who come to the United States and think, okay, I'm here in the US. The US has free speech. I can finally speak my mind. And they find out maybe they can't, either because of their peers, because of the Chinese government, or perhaps even because of their own university. And so, there's a lot happening here that I think helps explain how these factors are playing into higher ed right now and why it's creating free expression issues in a lot of different ways.
Yeah, and I mean, there's you have a whole book on it, but there's so many places to jump off here. And I'm wondering because I wasn't quite aware of how entwined different universities were kind of with foreign governments, especially when they set up satellite campuses in countries that have far more explicitly restrictive speech policies and other policies that in the US, we consider not good policies, especially with free speech. And how can you explain kind of what's going on in terms of when campuses set up satellite campuses, either in China, because I know China was a big focus of your book, or in other countries, because there's a lot of satellite campuses, especially with high profile universities. This tends to be, or at least it seems to be a very good business opportunity for universities. So can you kind of explain what's going on there? There's a clear conflict of interest in terms of the values that these universities espouse, especially with free expression and the purpose of the university. And then these campuses are being set up in countries that have no speech protections or very restrictive speech policies. So really who's in charge? When push comes to shove and there's actually a case, what is actually happening? Is there specific examples that you can draw to that highlight where the principles may not be the grounding point
Yeah,
here?
so it's definitely an open question of who is in charge, but I can affirmatively state that it is not clearly and confidently the American university partner. And so I write about these partnerships that American universities have with other nations or universities abroad. And there's kind of a range of how concerning they should be. Study abroad programs, for example, a lot of problems can result there. For example, if you're sending students without fair warning to countries where they might go to prison because they hold up a sign at a protest or something. But on the more serious and permanent end of it is the satellite campuses that you brought up. And so I think in the early 2000s, universities started pursuing these because there's really great opportunities that can come from it. There's financial benefit for universities. There's benefits they can provide to their students with individualized research opportunities and local on the ground things that you maybe can't get in the United States. I mean, there are a lot of majors where it's very important to be able to go to China or the Middle East and be able to, conduct some research there or, whatever you need to do at those campuses. But the universities that have made these programs, these satellite campuses, they have done so under the notion that we are bringing our American campus to the UAE and we are going to offer what our American campus offers there, but with new and different regional opportunities. But as you said, those countries have different laws, and some of them are just outright incompatible with American style promises of academic freedom and free expression. And so, a good example here is what's happened with some of the campuses in Qatar. So there, Northwestern University, for example, they decided to host an event with a Lebanese rock band, and that band, its lead singer is gay. And there was some degree of controversy. Northwestern said, never mind, we're going to host this in the US instead. And there were security concerns, so we're just not going to do that here. But the Qatar Foundation, which is their partner and a state-linked body that helps manage these American campuses in the country, they said that's not what happened here. The event was stopped because it did not correlate with Qatari laws and social customs. So which is it? Is Northwestern's policy determining what happens on the campus? Is it Qatari law? And even aside from that, which I think is a very important question, is Northwestern even being honest about who's in charge and who makes the rules? And that's ultimately, I think, the most important question. Because, there are better arguments, I think, for these campuses if everyone who's going into it understands exactly what kind of limits are going to be placed upon them. And there was something similar at Georgetown's campus in Qatar, where there was a debate about female depictions of God that had to be canceled because of Qatar's blasphemy law. And so, we have to ask, not only is it possible to offer these free speech and academic freedom protections at these satellite campuses, but can we even trust that universities will be honest about specifically and exactly what limits they'll be up against and what power they have to push back against government repression or government laws? And I don't feel very confident about that right now. And one more point on this, I think that when a lot of universities pursued these campuses, especially in China, it was not quite the same political situation then, 10 or 15 years ago, that it is now. And so a big part of it, I think, is understanding that you have to have a fluid and constantly renewed interest and awareness of what's happening on the ground in those countries because, as we've seen, political situations can change overnight in countries. So you can't just have it be static. You have to constantly, reinvestigate whether it still makes sense to have that campus.
Yeah, and there's actually two questions now in the Q&A box that kind of bring up an interesting line. So I'm going to kind of put them together because they both kind of hit on the same issue of differences with free speech protections in private universities. Obviously, private universities. So one of the question askers is describing Brigham Young University, who has very specific speech codes, especially because it's a religious private university. But in general, private universities typically affirm or promise some sort of First Amendment speech protections. And I assume that some of these satellite campuses are set up by private universities as well. So even in the US, we have some room where speech protections may be slightly less, depending on how private universities want to address or how. Um, compatible they want to be with the First Amendment. But do we see any differences in the satellite campuses with private universities versus more public universities that are bound by the First Amendment, or is being in that kind of just a different country, those ultimately those speech codes seem to kind of trump our whatever the speech codes of the university are?
Yeah, well, so for the most part, off the top of my head, I can only think of one public university. No, maybe two public universities that have, pursued these satellite campuses. For the most part, it's been something that, at least in like large scale brick and mortar satellite campuses, that private universities have been interested in pursuing. But it's a good question about private universities more broadly and the reasons why they choose to um, have these kind of speech restrictive policies, for example, like some religious universities in the US. That's something we've written about a lot at Fire. And, our position is if universities have those policies, they have made commitments to their students and faculty, and they need to honor them. And we think you get a better education when you have free speech and academic freedom protections and you have the ability to openly question and pursue new ideas with freedom.
Mhm.
But universities do also have the right, private universities have the right to create speech restrictive policies, even if we don't think it's a good idea. But again, the key thing is transparency and openness. If you are offering what you promised, that's one thing. If you are not offering what you promised, that's a entirely separate thing.
Yeah, and that the role of the administrators, and this is kind of circling to a point that you mentioned earlier, is students need to be able to trust that say they're on a U.S. campus, they're an international students, they need to be able to trust that their administration will protect them or back them up in these cases where there may be threats because of their express speech on campus. And it seems like from your opening example that you mentioned that students don't necessarily tend to trust their administration because it seems that maybe there hasn't been a clear pattern that the administration is going to uphold and defend very vigorously their free speech and the importance of free expression. And so I would love to dive into that a little bit of, what do we know about kind of, I guess, a track record for administration for defending these values or that overall kind of sense of fear that students have for their administration to protect their rights when they're here on US campuses. And even maybe bigger, is it their responsibility inherently to be protecting international students?
So in my experience, I have not seen many universities respond to the specific kind of threats international students have been facing for the past few decades in the US. One of the rare notable examples is Purdue University, which did issue a statement after one of its students, who was an international student from China, he was targeted by his peers who threatened to report him to Chinese authorities because he was participating in events about the Tiananmen massacre. And he actually had security officials visit his family as well and warn them that he needed to shut up. That's one of the rare circumstances that I'm aware of where a university has come forth and said, this kind of repression is unacceptable on our campus. We are not allowed to have, foreign government's laws dictating what can be said here. But I think part of the problem there is that students don't really trust that if a university felt like it was between defending their student against a foreign government and protecting their access to financial opportunities that might be offered by that foreign government, I don't think students think that universities will pick them.
Mhm.
I think over the years they have really seen the way that universities have talked about and pursued those kinds of partnerships. And I can understand why a student who passes a Confucius Institute on campus might think my university is maybe not going to choose me if I feel like I'm in some dispute over my rights with the Chinese government. And I understand where they're coming from. And I think if universities want to, as they should, if they want to be doing the best they can to ensure their students have the right to speak freely on campus, A, they need to not be doing the censorship themselves, but B, they also need to be, considering and looking into what specific kind of threats all of their students face, because this is a really specific threat for international students. And there are campuses where you can have 40, 50% of students be coming from abroad. So it's not like it's just a few campuses. If you have, or a few students, if you have thousands of students at your campus that might be facing this kind of threat, I think you should understand and see how it may be limiting their rights and the rights of their peers.
Yeah. And there's the role that, you were just describing of kind of how administrators can and should be defending their students. And I'd love to discuss a little bit of kind of your take on the role of individual faculty in this kind of space of protecting students. I've seen some interesting op-eds written, especially with research. So a lot of international students come over for graduate studies when they're doing research, and depending on what kind of lab you're in, you could be working in a lab where the research that's being conducted isn't permissible or it's risky once you finish your graduate studies and go back to your home country. And I can't recall the exact title of the article and the author, but they were basically arguing that professors have an ethical responsibility to protect the students that are international students that are working in their labs and kind of help guide their research decisions to ensure that they are not putting themselves at risk when they finish their studies because they go home. And I love the intention of that, and it's very similar to some of the tenured professors' advice often that is, choose safe research topics until you get tenure, and then when you get tenure, you can expand a little more broadly. And that's a very common piece of advice. But when we, cut it down, it is essentially advocating for some self-censorship in a way of what the research that we're conducting is. So I'm curious of what your take on that is, because there is kind of this legal versus ethical, just general ethical responsibility. And I think it's important, students are coming to us and they trust professors and want to do as much as they can in their labs to advance their studies. But like, how would you approach that kind of argument?
Yeah, I think it's a really fascinating question. I think there are a few different angles to look at it from. But to put a broad principle on it, I think um, professors and academics should do what's within their power to protect the students they may be working with, to the extent that it doesn't limit their own academic freedom or even their students' academic freedom. So, if we're talking about classrooms, for example, this was something that I wrote about happening during the COVID online teaching era, where academics were saying, okay, should we do blind grading? Should we do one-on-one conversations so students aren't fearful that they're being recorded over Zoom by their classmates? I think there are really interesting and unique ways that academics can approach novel ideas to protect their students if they think that the material they're discussing puts them in danger. But what they also can't do is say, you know what, this area of research is going to be a little bit dangerous for some of my students. So I'm going to limit for everyone what we're going to discuss and what we're going to teach, because that's how authoritarian countries win. That's how you have other countries' censorship rules. Limiting what can be said in American classrooms. And I also think that we need to respect the agency of the students that come here from abroad. I think as long as they understand the risks, as I'm sure they do, maybe talk to them, make sure there's agreement and understanding, but they also might want to come here and be able to engage in research and expression and study that they don't have access to at home. So to make that decision for them and say, I'm going to protect you, not every student maybe wants to be protected. Some of them
Yeah.
might say, I have access to this freedom and I want to use it. So I definitely don't censor yourself, don't censor other students, and don't make the decision for students in their best interests if you don't, you know,
Yeah.
if you aren't certain that that's what they even want in the first place. So find ways that you can to protect them, but um, don't recreate a repressive environment to protect them from another repressive environment.
Yeah, and I think that was a really great point that you underscored in your book, is like not allowing this kind of self-censorship to permeate for everyone, especially in classroom settings, where in recent years, for a lot of reasons, I really want to get to the tech piece because I think that's a really huge and important area of this kind of authoritarian influence and risk and fear that is occurring on campuses, especially in classrooms with students. Um, but there's a related question here in the chat. If where did it? Okay. With you talk about in the book kind of like the sensitivity crackdown. I think probably a lot of viewers in our audience are aware of kind of these kind of almost over prescriptive rules to help create like safe and non-offensive environments, especially in the classroom. And one viewer asked, to what extent do you think Title VI of the Civil Rights Act um, prohibits prohibits the creation of hostile environments and how those impinge on student and faculty free speech? Because he says many administrators extend these rules to assert that anything that makes others uncomfortable creates a hostile environment. And I know there was cases in your book that you discussed where, some students feel uncomfortable because even being in the classroom where certain topics are discussed, if they can be linked to those classrooms by different governments, that creates a risk. So I'm curious what your view on that is.
Yeah, it's a good question, and what I discuss in the book is the rise of codes that sort of address insensitivity and bias and offense, and the way that it's sort of a Pandora's box. If it's carelessly written or carelessly applied, the way these policies are created, because what it can do is, I think a lot of these are probably coming from a good place where people say, I want, students to feel welcome. I think that's kind of a big
Mhm.
angle here, like making sure that campus is a welcoming environment for all students. But if you don't create these policies in a viewpoint neutral way or enforce them in a viewpoint neutral way, what you're going to have is students saying, okay, if you're going to censor or act on offensive speech, I think this speech about the Chinese government is offensive and hurtful. So why isn't the university doing something? On a broader, it's kind of a broad answer, but that is the risk of these kinds of policies in this specific issue that we're talking about here. You can't really place a limit on what a speech code or what a speech restriction is going to do. Once you write it, it's open for everyone, and you might see it applied in ways that you weren't expecting, but probably should have been.
Yeah. And there's I know you mentioned a lot in your book, especially in the post-COVID area when everything went online, that the very technology-based classroom is a big reason or a big catalyst for kind of this fear because now everything's trackable. Students aren't in a classroom where um, you know, there's not things being recorded and everything's done online and it can be traced to your computer and your name and all these other instances. And I know there was a course you were describing in your book where everyone had to have a pseudonym and like, you could be anonymous if you want. I know when I was back teaching in the post-COVID era, there was just cameras in the room that were recording all the time. So like I didn't even have control to turn them off, which I always made sure to alert students about is I'm like, if you want to come and talk to me, it just like it recorded it and automatically posted it to Canvas. So you have no control, even as the faculty member, to monitor the recordings in the room. Um, and I would love to hear how that's playing into things. Obviously, you mentioned Zoom, which we're on right now, and pretty much every class and workplaces use Zoom. And technology companies have been notorious in their you know, uh, concessions that they give to different countries in terms of data tracking and things like that. So this is a big question, but how has technology kind of facilitated this influence into classrooms, especially when it comes to chilling classroom discussions and with students in particular? What ways can faculty combat this? I know there's a big shift of, bring back the blue book and everything is kind of where, the pendulum swinging the other way to kind of bring everything back, especially with AI and all sorts of different tech tools. But it's a big launching point, but I would love to hear your take on this, because I'm sure we have a lot of faculty in the audience who have to deal with these technology issues in their classrooms as well.
Well, it would be very funny to me if, the fight against AI in the classroom ultimately helped to stop transnational repression in the classroom. But
What a headline!
so So there's a couple different ways I want to approach that question. The first is COVID happened and the move online happened. It overlapped in, historically horrible timing with the passage of Hong Kong's first national security law. And so I think people might, think, okay, what does Hong Kong's national security law have to do with anything? But so for starters, it's written to apply globally. So it's written to apply to offenses committed outside the region by people who are not residents of Hong Kong. So it's basically a global censorship law. And so that passed June 2020, I think it was, when we were all also going online. So we had at the same time basically every conversation, every class, every speech, every forum, everything was taking place online as this law passed that put a lot of fear into the millions of international students that are governed by China's laws and by Hong Kong's laws, who were starting to wonder, okay, what does this mean for my speech, which is now being tracked in a way it never was before? Everything I do is now online, and so I think that was a really alarming time for me, and I understand why universities they didn't have any control over a global pandemic. They couldn't control having to go online. But I think there was not enough consideration of the immediate academic freedom effects that come from, putting everything students do and academics do online in a highly surveilled world. But the second part about Zoom specifically, this isn't even just a question about international speech issues, but the way that we were, all using Zoom, Zoom has different priorities and different values and policies than the classroom, as any corporation is going to do. And so we essentially made a middleman for higher education. And for the most part, that did not blow up in our faces. But there was one pretty high profile controversy where academics were attempting I think it was San Francisco State, were attempting to host a Zoom event with Leila Khaled, who she's most known for hijacking an airplane in 1969, I think it was. And obviously, that's a very unpopular speaker for a lot of people. I don't think it's a mystery why, but it's not in free speech and academic freedom cases. It's not about how popular is a speaker or do you like the speaker. It's what tools and policies do we have in place. And so Zoom would not let that event go forth. They said you can't have this event on Zoom. And at the time, you couldn't really have events in person either because of the pandemic. And if I recall correctly, I think Eventbrite wouldn't allow them to host it either. And so it's not about a specific, widely unliked speaker. It's about what does it mean when a third party corporation who doesn't have academic freedom commitments becomes the classroom, becomes the public square, becomes the quad. What does that mean for us? And so fortunately, I hope we are past that, where we need to worry about what happens when online tech companies are the only ones where we can have events. But I think it's an interesting question that we need to think about going forward. I could see a world where, people decide we need to have a lot more online education because, it doesn't make sense climate-wise to have everyone commute to a school or, these brick and mortar campuses are too expensive to maintain. I think there is absolutely a world in which we could see a lot more online education in the future. God forbid another pandemic could happen. So I hope this is sort of a lessons learned. I hope we can retain the lessons of this and understand that going forward, we need to be a lot more careful and thoughtful about how we conduct online education.
Yeah, and the idea of the third party corporate values being different is very similar to the idea of third party governments being having different values as well. So really, there's this increased need for collaboration because, we can't expect universities to spin up their own technology tools when there's very good tools that exist already for these things. So in a very effectual sense, it matters to have collaborations with different third parties. But, having certain events, when online is the only option. Obviously, we do a lot of online events. It's a great way to broaden access to, different speakers, different ideas. There's a lot of benefits to it. But yes, I think the intentionality about how we build these and what rules we follow, and when universities stand up for that misalignment in values and how that's addressed is really important. Um, we have a few questions in the chat, so we're going to kind of shift around a little bit here. One person asked, do you think that American universities launching satellite campuses in faraway countries undermines trust in American higher education as a whole? It seems that these activities could fuel the notion that US academic institutions are governed by elites that are out of touch with ordinary citizens and thereby generate resentment. So we know public trust has been quite the the issue. We see a hopeful turnaround this year in the latest Gallup polls. But what's your response to that?
Yeah, I sort of have a lot of different responses, so I'll try to narrow it down to one or two. But yeah, obviously, public trust in higher ed has been suffering pretty badly lately. But I think, what's sort of an interesting corollary here is, the question of why are we starting these satellite campuses? I think most of the reason has been the financial benefits to universities. But I think they have also talked about it in a manner as if they're bringing um, freedom of expression and academic freedom to other countries where it's lacking, and they're going
Hmm.
to be, freer spaces for education and debate. And that is absolutely to some extent true, but I think it does harm trust in these universities when people can ask, okay, why were you doing this in the first place? And did you even achieve what you said the stated goal was? Because, there's this concept of universities being the pockets of freedom abroad. And to what extent have uh, they followed through on that? It's very mixed. And, a question which I don't feel equipped to answer, but I think is very interesting to discuss is it appropriate for universities to make that their goal? I think it's a noble, worthy goal, but is that something that they're actually able to deliver? And are
Hmm.
they being honest about their capacity to do that in the first place? So it's an interesting discussion kind of more broadly about in some ways American soft power and what it means.
Yeah, that's a great point. Because we often talk about the core purpose of the university, so I can see lines and arguments to be made for how that can advance, the core knowledge generating purpose of our institutions, with kind of a bigger feeding into these larger democracy and noble goals, which is helpful. But I think there's also a lot of financial interest that also, when push comes to shove, can, as we talked about earlier, especially when there is violations of local speech codes, how when push comes to shove, we actually see what priorities are coming out on top, which can
And
be,
we see who's being
yeah,
pushed and who's being shoved.
yeah,
Yes.
exactly, exactly. Um, I'll do some other kind of rapid fire work here, and this is something that we haven't touched on yet. So we've talked a lot about universities going to other countries, but not kind of about how other countries may be gaining footholds on U.S. soil. And you talked about Confucius Institutes a lot in your book and the roles there. So this is a little bit of a long question, but let me see if I can say this succinctly. So the story isn't much in the news lately, but your research on Confucius Institutes on campus in the US and other Western countries, how has their influence has waned on campus? I think you mentioned there's only a few left, but they wonder what lessons there are in that case study for kind of your general argument in your book of, how we can uh, decrease foreign censorship on campuses.
That's a really good question because I do think there are some important lessons to take away from the Confucius Institute debacle over the past couple of decades in the US. So, quick rundown for anyone who's unfamiliar. Confucius Institutes are formed by an American university or any foreign university and a Chinese university, with the Chinese government kind of the middleman moderating that relationship and providing funding and materials and things like that. And we had at its peak 115, maybe I want to say, in the United States. But they were a really public sign an example of the Chinese government's presence in American higher ed. And there was a lot of political firepower that was put into eliminating Confucius Institutes. There were a lot of state by state legislation, a lot of coordination from elected officials, encouraging universities to abandon their Confucius Institutes. And I think it was absolutely a good thing to have more attention on the role that the Chinese government plays. But I also think it was in some ways a mistake to understand that as the primary, form or the most worrying example of authoritarian interference in higher education. Because I did and do have a lot of concerns about Confucius Institutes, but just forcing universities to get rid of Confucius Institutes doesn't, A, get rid of the relationships that universities have overseas, and it doesn't necessarily address the most problematic ways that those relationships form. And it also, I think, doesn't fully draw attention to the most severe forms of censorship happening in the US on campuses that's related to the Chinese government. So I think the lessons are, give a short answer after a long one. I think the lessons are it's good to be paying attention to these things, but it's important that we not lose sight of what forms of influence are the most worrying. Because in some ways, Confucius Institutes were kind of like a big red arrow saying, like, this university has a partnership with the Chinese government. And without that Confucius Institute, that relationship might still be there, but it's perhaps not as noticeable or obvious to outside observers.
Yeah, and this actually relates to another question that I see from viewers of kind of the maybe not as obvious influence of Chinese interference in universities. This is just shifting gears a little bit to the UK, and I know you focus on global speech issues, so hopefully this is kind of within your realm too. So they ask, in the UK, there are credible reports of Chinese interference with the way courses are taught, similar to what has happened in the US. But given recent strengthened freedom of speech and academic freedom laws, the higher ed regulator says it may be reasonable to discontinue these schemes if students, for example, are required to pass a political test to get into the US to study at these universities. So it's a two-part question. Is this too extreme, or is anything similar being done here in the US?
So I'm not completely up on what's been happening in the UK. I know there have been a lot of reports and news that came out in the past few weeks covering the different forms of influence and the way their new higher education legislation might limit how universities can have these relationships abroad. I don't have is the question asking should the US government be doing more specifically about these students or
I'm reading it as the idea of students having to pass a political test to study in the US. Is that too extreme, or making sure kind of maybe a filtering mechanism of some sort? And then is anything like that potentially being discussed in the US?
okay.
That's what
Okay, I
that's
see.
what I'm inferring.
So I'm uncomfortable with, if our objection is to the Chinese government having some kind of political monitoring and testing of their students, I'm uncomfortable with solution being some form of the same. Um, so on that, I would be uncomfortable with that being an avenue that we pursue. I think the way that we're going to fix it is that universities reject these kinds of efforts to censor that might be coming from students who, might have this opinion or who might, want to limit what's said on the campus about the Chinese government. I think so as to not also, put limits on students' freedom, I think it's just going to have to be the role of universities to, faithfully and clearly enact their free speech policies to ensure that they're not letting any censorship happen like this.
Mhm. And this gets to, since we're kind of nearing the last part of the hour here, one thing that I'm sure everyone is interested in is what can be done about this. I know in the end of your book, as one should, you do conclude with some possible solutions. But for those who have not had a chance to read your book yet, what are some of the biggest kind of maybe handful of solutions that you see for, maybe individual faculty who are a lot of the folks watching today, and then especially anyone in some sort of leadership position on campus, what can be done from maybe those two positions to kind of help decrease this influence, either decrease self-censorship because of it, or actual policy-based things that can be done on campus by leaders in that position.
Sure. So when it comes from the administrative side, I think they need to understand that international students or students who fear that they're going to face some kind of repression, they don't think that they can talk to administrators. And so they haven't been doing so. And so I think administrators need to be doing what they can to make sure those students know that they can speak perhaps anonymously to their international students office, to university leadership, so that the university can be crafting policies and can at least understand the unique kind of threats that these students are facing. Because you might have, I don't know, dozens of students on your campus who think that if they post a tweet or if they take a class about Islam in China, that their parents are going to get in trouble at home. So you need to find a way to reach those students and make sure they understand that they have the ability to speak on campus and that the university is going to do something to help them. And part of that is offering orientation programming for international students. I think even a lot of Americans don't understand some of the basics of the First Amendment sometimes. So we can't totally expect international students who have grown up in a wildly different legal system to come here and know what our speech laws are. So make
Yeah.
sure they come here, make sure they understand what those laws are. But in the time since I've written this book, the question of international students' speech rights in the U.S. has become significantly more complicated, and that's something that we've been advocating for. A fire. We've been really, really disturbed and concerned about, um, the very understandable feeling that students may have that if they say the wrong thing, they might be deported. So
Mhm.
that's now something that universities are going to have to figure out as well. What can they tell to their students who are fearful that, they're going to lose their visa because they engage in the speech that, a citizen classmate is free to engage in. So on the university side, that's something they need to deal with. When it comes to the classroom, some of the things that I was talking about earlier, finding ways to creative solutions to perhaps protect your students without limiting their rights or yours. So whatever that might look like, it might mean saying, if you feel uncomfortable voicing your opinion in class, you can come talk to me after, and that's the way we can discuss your take on what's happening in the classroom. And also when crossing borders, if you're conducting research in authoritarian country, make sure you're protecting student data properly if it's on your devices. Perhaps even when you're coming back from the US, you need to make sure that your devices are not going to be looked at, or you don't have sensitive material on there. So I think data security is important as well.
Yes. And you mentioned in your response, kind of the current, federal landscape with universities has changed quite a bit. We were chatting before we went live that I think you said you finished kind of writing this book right before the administration change. So I know folks are curious, and one of the questions in the chat asks specifically how the federal environment between elite universities and federal government is playing into your analysis right now. I know you mentioned, on the university side, they need to deal with how to protect students that are following their rules and our laws. But is there anything that you want to offer to the audience post your book publishing about the current state of affairs with federal government, but also foreign governments as well, and since you finished writing?
Yeah, I undertook this book because I fundamentally and deeply oppose governments using their power and will to try to censor and silence dissent around the world in higher education. And so you can probably see how I feel about what's been happening the past 6 months. But something I said in the book was that universities, they need to be expected to make what may in some cases be costly decisions. to defend their values. It might mean saying we're not going to accept this partnership because we think there are restrictions on academic freedom that are going to come from it. We might have to dip into our endowment if we, lose some kind of partnership that we had been relying on for funding, or we might have to change our tactics. I think the same thing might apply here. We're going to have to be, or we have to expect our universities to prioritize their values over their financial opportunities and over political expediency. I mean, that's ultimately some of what universities have, it's what's gotten them into this mess with foreign censorship. And so I think, some of the same things are going to have to be expected. When it comes to their dealings with the Trump administration. But what does worry me is that I do think right now we are creating greater incentives, significantly greater incentives for universities to look at more funding sources that may create new worrying restrictions and new
Mhm.
forms of influence. So um, I'm trying not to be pessimistic about the potential solutions for this issue at the moment, but I do think it's gotten significantly harder, and it's sort of a multi-front battle that universities are going to need to fight. But I think they just need to take a stand across the board against letting governments tell them what they can say and teach.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's really contributing. I think a common theme that I see across your book is just a general fear on campus. We know this, you're at Fire and we're here at HXA. We've done a lot of survey work assessing perceptions of fear, and we know that students are fearful of other students reporting things, which we mentioned earlier. Faculty are fearful of other faculty reporting things. Everyone seems to have some fear of the administration not being able to stand up for those things. Federal interference, foreign interference. There's a lot of fear going on campus, and, across the board for a lot of different reasons. We've talked a lot already about how campus leaders can kind of step up and be really clear in their communications about what's going on, and where their principles. But is there anything else you want to offer to the individuals that are also within that university system, what they can do to help kind of diminish some of this fear and create spaces that are as open as possible, especially in their research labs or in their classrooms? Anything to kind of close out your
Yeah,
perspective on this?
I've hit this a couple ways that, different discussions we've had, but I really think transparency matters here,
Hmm.
because, a lot of the fear, I think, I talk about in my book is because there isn't transparency from universities about their partnerships abroad, about what it means for their values, about all of that. But some of the new fear we're seeing is there isn't transparency in how universities might be dealing with the federal government. And, um, you know, academics and students might be right to worry that there are some kind of backdoor deals that are being made that are going to be private, that they're not going to be represented in. And so I think a commitment to transparency would solve or at least help address some of this, because if you feel like your university isn't hiding things, you're going to be able to trust a little bit more that they're being honest with you.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a lot of work that we can do as individual faculty, campus leaders, and doing our best in our roles. But I fully agree that transparency is really the big key to all of this, from every level of the university, and always just being honest and clear about how things are going. Is there anything you want to say to close out in terms of your book, or any points that maybe we didn't hit on that you'd love to have viewers here know that can possibly help them before they go buy your book?
I hope you buy the book. Thank you if you do. But if you ever run into any of these issues on your campus, please reach out to Fire. We may be able to help you, and we would like to if we could. We understand that a lot of people on campus right now are feeling they can't speak freely for a lot of different reasons. So if that's you, please come to us and let us know what's going on. And outside of the campus context, I write about these issues more broadly. So if you're interested in global free expression more generally, I have a newsletter that we can share with you. That if you're interested in getting a monthly update on what's going on with the world, please subscribe.
Awesome. Well, Sarah, I just want to say thank you so much. And to everyone watching, please do go pick up a copy of Sarah's book. It just went on sale. I'm trying to make my filter work here. It just went on sale last week. So it's always great to support authors in this area. And it's a really informative book. As someone who's kind of been generally following issues in this space, I know I learned a lot, especially about specific cases and details of just really how things are going on. And this is an extremely important book for this time that we're in. So I hope maybe in a couple years you have a follow-up book of everything that's happened
I hope to
since
have
then.
less to write about.
I think there's plenty. And Marisa from HXA is going to drop some links in the chat. So if you'd like to purchase this book, and of course, to everyone watching, we thank you for taking the time today, of course, to be here. And please visit our website and sign up for HXA's newsletter to keep up to date on more events that we have. So Sarah, again, thank you so much. It was a really enlightening conversation. I hope folks in the audience have learned quite a bit too and are motivated to buy more to buy your book and learn more because there's so much going on in this book. So I really encourage folks to purchase a copy today.
Thanks so much.